Welcome, C3, both of you here in person and those online. Thank you for joining with us. I'd like to take a moment and introduce you all to some celebrated artistes. This one was celebrated because of the mesmerizing effect the drawing had on those who dared to gaze upon it. This one was celebrated because it just made you feel like the coffee was smiling back at you. This one was celebrated because the eyes and the nose just felt like they were coming right out at you. Now you might be wondering what critically acclaimed institution celebrated these artists? And I'm sure you've probably guessed it by now. It wasn't any of those. These artists were celebrated by none other than their parents. We're starting a new series today called More, Next Steps in Our Journey of Faith. And in this series, we're admitting a couple things. Number one, that we are all works in progress, pastors included, and that God desires more for our lives. He desires more mission, more purpose, more progress in our faith, more knowing Him, more life from Him in our lives. But that journey to more is one that requires steps of faith along the way. And so it calls us to be a people who are willing to take our next steps forward into the more that God has for us. Last week at Easter, Pastor Adam shared a story about how he and Leah celebrated the first steps that their children took. And I also have a proud papa story. I remember feeding my oldest, Galia, the first time she ate solid foods. It was some kind of rice cereal, and we were first-time parents, so I think we have it on VHS somewhere because you film everything, every moment when you're the first-time parent. And going back and reviewing tape on that moment, I would have to say that about, and these are just rough estimates, maybe 10% of the food made it into her stomach. The other 90% landed on her face, on my face, on the walls, the ceilings, the floor, and everywhere else. And yet, as parents, we celebrated that moment as a momentous step forward because we knew instinctively as parents that the only way that our children would grow would be if we celebrated small steps, which is exactly the big idea that I want to share with you today, that celebrating small steps creates great change. That the more and more we learn to celebrate the little milestones on the journey, the far more energized we are to continue moving forward towards the more that God has for each and every single one of our lives. And this is, I think, something that as church we really need to hear, because we tend to forget this spiritual dynamic in our own lives. A lot of times in church, we tend to celebrate those who have made it in that sense. We see people who know lots about the Bible and we applaud that, or people who have traveled across the world in order to do great things for God, and we applaud that, but we forget the tiny steps along those individuals' journeys that actually took them to that place. And here's the inadvertent problem. As we're applauding these giants in the faith, there's a very real opposing force that says to us, or maybe we whisper to ourselves, man, I could never be that person. I could never be like her. I could never be like him. So why try? And so we end up being stuck exactly where we are. But Jesus frequently warns those who are following him not to miss out on the great things that God was doing, because those things happen to begin small. And so I'd like to share with you a story that he uses to illustrate this very dynamic. It's one of Jesus's illustrations. We call those parables, and it comes to us in Matthew chapter 13, verse 31 and 32. You can follow along in your own Bible if you've got it, or it'll be on the screen beside me. Matthew 13, 31 and 32. Jesus put another parable before them, saying, "The kingdom of heaven is like a grain of mustard seed that a man took and sowed into his field. It is the smallest of all seeds, but when it has grown, it is larger than all the garden plants and becomes a tree, so that the birds of the air can come and nest in its branches." Now, a couple weeks ago, we talked about Jesus, his concept of the kingdom of God, a very important thing that he talks about, how Jesus was telling folks through talking about the kingdom that God's presence, power, and perfection was available to them, and not just when they got to heaven, but that heaven was invading the right now, and that they could experience the kingdom of God through Jesus in their right now, day-to-day experiences. But the concern that Jesus is illustrating here is that these people might miss it because it comes in small packaging. And so Jesus' very warning here in the story, if you notice the very words that he's emphasizing here, is that this mustard seed, even though it's small, they might miss the fact that this small seed can lead to large and great things. And so he wants them to pay attention to that. And you can kind of think about the context of Jesus saying that to the crowds around him, because here's Jesus and his 12 ragtag followers, right? They didn't look to anybody on the outside as people who were really truly spiritual in that day. I mean, even Jesus, as miraculous as his life clearly was, didn't exactly fit the mold that most people in that day were looking for. They didn't believe that he dressed the part. They didn't think he came with the right kind of background or credentials. He shared stories about God being this loving father who wanted to be personally involved in our life, and that didn't fit with what a lot of them had grown up thinking. So Jesus was kind of unorthodox, and so someone who might have been easy to miss. But Jesus in that 12 ragtag group, that little mustard seed, continued to grow and grow, and it's estimated that about 2 billion people last Sunday celebrated Easter. This parable certainly describes how Jesus' kingdom grows on the outside, but I think it describes how the kingdom grows on the outside because it's revealing how it grows on the inside of each and every one of us as well. Small changes, small steps, rather, create great change within us. And yet it's easy for us to forget our roots as the church, and we forget the humble beginnings of our faith. And I'm sure that there's some of you who maybe have gathered here or maybe online with us who have encountered some Christians who weren't really quick to celebrate the small steps in your life. Maybe they held up a giant standard that you never felt like you could measure up to, or that they were comparing you to. And it made you feel like you couldn't be included or involved, or that there was no room for you in our faith. And if that describes you in some way, I hope that you can hear my message as an invitation to change the way that you think about yourself and your faith. Not to think of yourself as a failure, but just someone who is taking their next step of faith. Someone who no longer has to live under the shadow of what you're not, because you can see the bright light of what God intends for you to become. And that's a journey that we as a church would love to celebrate with you, little step after little step, all along the way. Because that's something we need to hear. Jesus' church has never grown in any other way than this. And I want to share with you another story from the Bible, from a man by the name of Paul, one of the letters that he wrote. Now, he wasn't one of the original 12 ragtag followers, but I think he's a good person to talk to about this issue of how the church truly goes, because he was involved in planting numerous small churches around the first century Roman Empire. And so if anybody knew how the church could grow and multiply, Paul might be the resident expert on that particular subject. And he was, even though he wasn't part of the original 12, he also had a checkered past. He had grown up thinking that in religion, the best thing that he could be would be holier than thou, looking down on people who didn't quite measure up to his standards. But he didn't let his past slow him down, even though he felt the burden of it closely behind him. And so in one of his letters to the church in Philippians, he talks about this struggle of taking steps of faith and leaving the past behind us. And he describes to them how he views his spiritual growth and the goal of growth that God has placed before him. And so this comes from his letter to the Philippians. So it's Philippians chapter 3, verses 12 and 15. This is where Paul says this. He says, "Not that I've already obtained this or am already perfect." So he's saying, hey, I'm just a work in progress here. You know, I haven't attained it yet. "But I press on to make it known, because Christ Jesus has made me his own. Brothers, I don't consider that I have made it on my own. But one thing I do," here's that dynamic, "forgetting what lies behind and straining forward to what lies ahead, I press on toward the goal of the prize of the upward call of God in Christ Jesus. Let those of us who are mature think this way." And just one quick note before we get to that spiritual dynamic that Paul describes here. I just love how he ends by saying, hey, if you think you're mature, this is the way you ought to think. Because I think a lot of times we consider that celebrating baby steps are only good for spiritual babies. That it may be fine to celebrate small steps when people are new to the faith, but once we grow up and we're mature, we need to hold ourselves to a higher standard. But normally, all that really means when we talk about holding ourselves to a higher standard is focusing on how much we aren't who we should be, rather than seeing how much God has already done in our lives. It's a spiritual dynamic that will certainly make you feel guilty, but it will not certainly grow you in the faith. You'll feel a lot of guilt, but you won't necessarily grow. And honestly, that may describe a lot more of you than you're willing to even acknowledge. That we began our journey celebrating little steps of faith, and we saw ourselves growing, and then somehow we got focused on what we weren't rather than what God has already done in our lives. And so we got stuck in our faith. And nobody likes to feel stuck and guilty for what they're not measuring up to. And so a lot of us, to alleviate that sense of feeling guilty, started shifting the focus off of ourselves and onto other people. and looking at how they don't measure up, and this person isn't as good as this and this person. And so instead of facing what we didn't want to look at in the mirror, we began to fill ourselves with media and books that alleviated our sense of guilt, made us feel better by highlighting how bad other people or the world is. But those who are mature shouldn't think that way. Paul lays out a completely different spiritual dynamic for growth for us here, and he summarizes it there in the 13th and 14th verse, where he simply says, forgetting what lies behind, straining for what lies ahead, I press on. He doesn't focus on what he wasn't or isn't, but what he could be and how he can, in fact, get there. And so if we're going to employ this dynamic in our own lives, I'm asking you, begging you, practically in the sermon, to learn the small skill of celebrating small steps of faith. To become the kind of people who are willing to get down and celebrate the spiritual crumbs in a journey of faith that sometimes it's a journey that just progresses inch after inch after inch. But if we're steadily celebrating those small steps, we will, in fact, get there one day, because the celebrating of each and every step has a snowball effect upon our lives and those around us who we implore this with, where they will continue to grow faster and faster and faster. I'm sure all of you have heard this, mathematical riddle. Like it begins like, would you rather win the lottery, a lottery of $1 million today, or have someone give you a penny and double it every single day after that? Right? You've all heard this little math riddle, right? Would you rather win a $1 million lottery or have a doubled penny? But do you know that it only takes 30 days of that doubled penny to have over $10 million? Celebrating small steps creates great change. So let me share some key concepts that I think are important to understanding this dynamic if you're really going to add it into your spiritual vocabulary. The first one is, and we've already talked about it quite a bit, that focusing on missteps will not bring great change into your life. If you're in a race, and you can probably YouTube a ton of these people who lose races at the last minute. They lose because in the last few yards, they decide to look backwards. Now, this never happened to me, but if you're ever being chased by a lion, you might be tempted to look back, but I promise you, the answer is always run faster. Run faster. Don't evaluate the situation. I've already figured it out for you. The answer is run faster. Now, all of this talk, I'm sure, about, forgetting what's behind us and pressing on to what lies ahead may raise a true and honest question or concern in some of your minds, and I do want to address that here in a second, which is, well, what about a repentance? What about saying sorry? What about all those things? Because I'm sure a lot of us may have experienced people in our lives who, they want to forget the past. They want to forget a lot of things that they did that they hurt you with, and sometimes they even use that against you, like, the past is in the past, and it was never truly dealt with. And I would just want to address that because I think it is a true spiritual problem. I would say that the people that I've met who truly are those who forget what lies behind learn to do the very opposite thing. Which is that celebrating small steps actually helps us acknowledge the past. And the people who are truly focused on growing generally are those who are faster and better at apologizing than the people who are focused on preserving their reputation. Because again, their whole concept is how high am I? How do I compare to other people? When our focus isn't on our reputation instead of our future, it's all about the past, because our reputation is all about our past, and we're worried about preserving the past, and we're worried about preserving our image. So saying I'm sorry to God or to other people can be super threatening to those people, because all of their identity is located in the past. It's not about the future or what God has for them or the more that he has. It's all about who they were, not who they are becoming. And so I'm inviting you today to forget about your track record, to lead a Christian life that is always focused on the next season and the next season and next season, instead of playing tape constantly in your mind about what you did wrong. And if you do that, you'll be more genuine in your apologies to God and others and more quick to do it, because all of your weight in life savings isn't in maintaining that reputation, which none of us really have a great one. So celebrating small steps helps us to acknowledge our past better. Another important key concept is that celebrating small steps is in fact the best way to keep ourselves safe. I know for a lot of us who have been hurt, it feels like the best way for us to stay safe is to keep one eye on the past, and that's completely understandable. When we've been hurt or injured in some way, we don't want that to ever happen again, and we think maybe the only way we can make sure that it doesn't happen again is by keeping one eye on the past. But the Bible gives a different way for us to be safe. It talks in a different part of the Bible about walking by the Spirit instead of walking by the flesh, when the flesh would be the bad way of living and walking by the Spirit would be good. And notice again what it says about how walking in the Spirit, taking those steps, small steps forward, actually protects us. This comes from Galatians 5:16 and 17, where it says, "But I say, walk by the Spirit, and you will not gratify the desires of the flesh. For the desires of the flesh are against the Spirit, and the desires of the Spirit are against the flesh. These are opposed to one another." So what it's saying here is that when our momentum is moving forward, taking these small steps of faith, and that's our focus, then these opposing forces can't work against us, because they are diametrically opposed to one another. It's kind of like the old cliche that the best defense is a good offense. Or if any of you caught the Final Four and the March Madness, if you're Baylor and you go up 10 points at the beginning of every single game and you maintain that, it's a pretty effective strategy to win. If I have the ball and I'm on offense, guess who can't score on me? There's a spiritual reality to that as well. If we're continue to celebrate small steps of faith moving forward, then we can't be the people who are sliding back at the same time. One final kind of key concept, I think, to becoming the kind of people who can celebrate small is that you really want to do this, because celebrating small honors God's big power. You see, Jesus told more than one story about mustard seeds. Another place he tells a story where he basically says, you know, if you have faith like a mustard seed, you can say to this mountain, go throw yourself in the sea, go jump in the lake, and it'll do it. Now, that's an interesting story for Jesus to tell. And I think it raises some questions about what the spiritual dynamics are going on there. Because who's being honored in that story? You know, certainly not you, who just has the smallest little molecule of faith, but God's great and amazing power to work in and through even a small step. That's who gets the honor in that story. And so when we are busy looking around to find these small little steps of faith, it's because we believe that hidden in those small steps is this amazing power that God is unleashing in our lives. And God never quits what he starts. In fact, earlier on in Philippians, Paul says this amazing line to the church. You may have heard this before. He says, I am sure of this, that he who began a good, I'm sure of this, he who began a good work will bring it to completion he's sure of this, that God who begins will see things through to the end. So when we're desperately looking around, searching through the dust for these little molecules of grace, we're searching for the beginnings of what God is doing in lives. And if we can find the beginnings of what God is doing, then we know, we have assurance, we have hope that he is going to continue it all the way to the end. It doesn't deny that there's a long journey, but it expresses our hope that there's a faithfulness from God that will see us all the way to the end. So we applaud the day of small beginnings because it highlights God's incredible power to do more than we can even conceive or imagine. And it certainly has nothing to do with us. So let me invite every single one of you to celebrate small. That we need to adopt a different spiritual vantage point for our journey of faith. That there's no spiritual hitting the lottery, and there's no crash spiritual diet. It's only a steady diet of healthy next steps of faith that will take us forward to the place that God intends for us. And for those of you who may not be completely convinced of the faith right now, I want to extend an invitation to you as well. Maybe you came in here or joined us online today and you jumped in and you felt, I'm 99% unsure about Christianity, but I'm going to hop on because I've got 1%. But maybe by the end of this message or the end of this series, maybe it's gone from 99% to 89%. And you know what? Celebrate that. Or maybe you came to this service thinking, I'm not really interested about the faith, but maybe now, instead of being not interested, you're curious. Celebrate that as a small step of faith forward. Or for those of you who have a real struggle with your track record, that concept of never measuring up, that really resonates with you all the time. I invite you to become the kind of person who can celebrate small steps with us, because it's no good to feel stuck. Maybe you feel stuck. You eat too much, or you drink too much, or you worry too much, or you swear too much, or you yell at the kids too much. And even today, maybe you've broken your promises already today. And the temptation is to say, I've already done it again. It's all ruined, failure again. But maybe you did yell at the kids today, but the day ain't over yet. And yesterday you yelled at them 10 times, but maybe today, maybe it'll only be 9 today, or 9.5. Celebrate small steps of faith. Say to yourself, I may not be perfect, but I'm better than yesterday. And feel the excitement to know that God is at work in your small steps of faith. Here's a step that may help you take those small steps. It's the next step, or a possible next step that you can adopt from this message, which is to take 5 days of this week and end them by celebrating 5 small steps of faith. It's the 5 for 5 plan. On sale now. And it's only 5 days in a week, so you don't even have to be perfect doing that. But end your day finding those things and really be relentless about this towards yourself. Don't let yourself off the hook until you find 5 things. You could probably find 5 things right now. I mean, you're listening to a message. Maybe you've taken some notes. Maybe you're thinking about ways that you can adopt this in your life already. Maybe you're thinking about an apology that you can make. You've already taken steps even in this moment. So certainly you can find 5 in 5 days to kind of reshape the way we think about how this journey is going. In this series, we're learning how God has more for us in our life and faith. And that by celebrating small steps, we can create great change in our lives. And their option is really up to you. You can adopt this from my message, or you can reject it. But it's the choice between going on this journey of faith, and it's a journey for all of us, regardless of what you think about me, and going on that journey in one way where you're constantly saying, are we there yet? Dad, are we there yet? Dad, are we there? You can do that. You have that choice today. Or you can go on this journey saying, wow, look at how far we have come. And that choice is yours. But I would say, in my defense, that Jesus, I think, would rather us view our faith as a journey of his amazing grace in our lives. And in fact, I believe that that's what we celebrate in communion, which we get to celebrate today. So with that, I'm going to invite the music team to come on forward as I explain a little bit about how Jesus shows that communion is the journey of grace that he wants to take all of us on. So some of you probably know that Jesus leaves 2 amazing symbols when it comes to our faith journey. Baptism, which we have the honor of celebrating coming up May 16th. And if you've never been baptized, this is a great way to just acknowledge, hey, I'm beginning the journey. I'm starting, and if you're interested in that, you can sign up for that online, right on c3wheeling.com. Click on the register here button and let us know you're interested, and one of us, probably me, I'll reach out to you and just find out a little bit about your faith journey. But that happens, that's kind of how we acknowledge the start of our faith journey. But then communion is something that Jesus wants us to do on an ongoing basis. So it's something that we're reminded of throughout the journey because he wants us to remember that the life of following him is always wrapped in the grace that is demonstrated for us through his death on the cross and the hope of the resurrection that he himself provides. And that's what he does in communion. Here at C3, we're going to practice communion. Hold on, let me grab one. Got it. Told you we weren't perfect. We're all works of progress. Here at C3, we practice open communion, which means that you don't have to be a card-holding member of C3 to participate with us. But if you're a follower of Jesus on this journey, we invite you to do it. So in that same vein, we leave it to parents to decide when their kids are ready to understand and receive this. If you came in here, if you're joining us in person today, hopefully you received one of these. If not, jog to the back or pick up the one I dropped here. And it's a kind of a 2-layer system. So under the really thin cellophane layer, you might want to flick it a little bit, is a wafer. And under that is the juice. So if you have it a moment, go ahead and reveal the wafer here. And let's talk about what Jesus did with his ragtag first followers. You see, on the night before Jesus was betrayed and ultimately crucified, he took this meal that his followers were sharing and created in it the story of grace that would continue with them on the journey. He said, take and eat. This is my body given for you. And in a similar way, later on in the meal, he took the common cup. And again, reminding them of what he was about to give to them, said, "This cup is the cup of the new covenant in my blood, poured out for the forgiveness of sins for you." And so when we, along the journey, participate in this meal, we remember Jesus' grace-giving death until he himself comes again to share it with us. So that's something to celebrate. So join me in celebrating these small steps of faith as we stand for one final worship song.